The most powerful words ever spoken are those that reach beyond the conscious mind and touch something ancient within us. What if I told you that the language that truly moves a man doesn't just enter through his ears, but resonates with something buried deep in his psyche? Carl Jung understood this profound truth nearly a century ago. He called it the collective unconscious, that vast reservoir of psychological patterns we all inherit simply by being human. These patterns, or archetypes as Jung named them, shape our desires in ways we rarely recognize consciously. Consider the last time you felt truly seen by someone, not just acknowledged, but recognized at a soul level. There's a reason that experience feels transformative. According to Jung, when someone speaks to our archetypal nature, they're not just communicating with our surface identity, they're connecting with the deeper patterns that have shaped human experience across millennia. Man's deepest desires aren't typically what appears on his wish list or social media profile. The material wants, the car, the promotion, the vacation, these are merely symbols pointing towards something far more fundamental. Jung would suggest that what men truly desire exists in the unconscious territory of the psyche. Take Tyler, a corporate executive I worked with in Chicago. By conventional standards, he had everything: financial success, professional recognition, a beautiful family. Yet he described feeling a persistent emptiness he couldn't name. In our conversations, what emerged wasn't a desire for more achievement, but a hunger for meaning. What awakened something in him wasn't hearing how successful he was, but rather questions that invited him to reconnect with the parts of himself he had abandoned along his climb. What adventure calls to you that you've been ignoring? This simple question triggered something profound in him, not because it was cleverly phrased, but because it spoke directly to his unfulfilled hero archetype, that part of us that yearns for challenges that test our true capacities. When we speak to someone as though they are already whole, not broken, not incomplete, we activate what Jung would call the self-archetype, the integrated wholeness that exists as potential within each person. These aren't manipulative techniques, they're invitations to authenticity. The language that awakens desire isn't about clever persuasion or psychological tricks. It's about speaking to the universal human experiences that Carl Jung mapped so thoroughly: the yearning for transformation, the search for meaning, the desire to integrate all parts of ourselves, even the shadows. What would it mean to speak to the archetypes within the men in your life? To recognize the warrior's need for righteous challenges, the magician's desire to transform the world through specialized knowledge, the lover's yearning for beauty and connection, or the king's drive to create order and provide. In American culture, men are often trapped in narrow expressions of these archetypes. We celebrate the warrior's competitive drive, but deny his need for worthy causes. We value the king's provision, but ignore his deeper wisdom. The words that truly awaken a man speak to these fuller dimensions. Consider how rarely most men hear language that addresses their emotional depth rather than their utility. How often do the words directed toward men acknowledge their inner complexity rather than their external performance? Jung would suggest that the most powerful communications bridge this gap. When someone feels truly understood, neural research shows that their brain actually synchronizes with the person understanding them. This isn't just psychological, it's biological. The right words create literal resonance between people. What are you really saying when you speak to the men in your life? Are you addressing only their personas, those carefully constructed masks Jung identified that we wear for social acceptance? Or are you finding the language that speaks to their authentic self? The secret to awakening desire isn't found in manipulation or technique. It's found in the courage to speak to the whole person, including the parts they themselves may not yet consciously recognize. When your words create a space where someone can experience their fullest self, desire awakens naturally. What would change if we began speaking to each other as though we could see the entirety of who we are, both our conscious identity and the deeper archetypal energies moving beneath the surface of awareness? What we consciously want is only half the story. The other half, perhaps the more powerful half, resides in shadow. Jung discovered that our deepest desires often hide in what he called the shadow self, those disowned aspects of our personality that we've learned to suppress or deny. Ironically, what a man rejects most forcefully might be precisely what he unconsciously desires most intensely. Consider how often we're drawn to people who embody qualities we claim to dislike. The structured businessman who can't stop thinking about the free-spirited artist, the rational scientist captivated by expressions of wild intuition. These attractions aren't random. They represent the psyche's attempt to become whole by reclaiming what's been exiled to shadow. In the context of desire, this creates a fascinating paradox. The words that awaken a man's deepest longing may be those that acknowledge parts of himself he's never given permission to exist. Take James, a high school principal from Portland, whose entire identity revolved around responsibility, structure, and maintaining control. In his leadership role, he prided himself on being the steady hand guiding his school. Yet in our conversations, what lit him up wasn't talk of greater efficiency or improved metrics. It was when I asked, "When was the last time you felt completely free?" His entire body language shifted. The question touched something buried, a yearning for spontaneity and unbounded expression that he'd long ago decided was incompatible with his role as an authority figure. The language that awakened his desire spoke directly to his shadow. Jung observed that what we push into shadow doesn't disappear. It goes underground and emerges in dreams, slips of the tongue, unexpected emotions, and inexplicable attractions. This is why the words that truly move us often surprise us. They're speaking to parts of ourselves we haven't fully acknowledged. In American culture, particularly for men, vulnerability, emotional sensitivity, and receptivity are often consigned to shadow. The cultural emphasis on strength, provision, and stoicism creates a predictable pattern of shadow formation. Many men learn early to push away their more receptive, nurturing qualities, yet these remain as unconscious desires waiting to be acknowledged. The language that awakens this terrain doesn't invalidate a man's conscious identity. It simply creates space for the fullness of his humanity. When someone speaks to both a man's conscious strengths and his shadow qualities with equal respect, something powerful happens. The psyche begins to integrate. Research from the field of interpersonal neurobiology supports this. When we feel safely seen in our complexity, including the parts we usually hide, our nervous system relaxes. The constant vigilance of maintaining our persona drops away. This state of authentic presence is where our truest desires can finally be felt and expressed. Consider the power of being asked, what part of yourself have you had to set aside to become who you are today? This isn't just a thoughtful question, it's an invitation to reclaim lost aspects of self. For many men who've built their lives around provision, achievement, and strength, this question touches the shadow terrain of vulnerability, wonder, and receptivity. The shadows aren't just repositories of negative qualities we wish to hide, they also contain our unlived potential, the roads not taken, the talents unexplored, the parts of ourselves sacrificed to fit cultural expectations. Jung called this the gold in the shadow, and accessing it is essential to feeling fully alive. Mark, a surgeon from Boston, described how his life changed when his wife, instead of continuing to push him to express more emotion, which only created resistance, began to honor both his stoicism and his capacity for deep feeling equally. She stopped treating my reserved nature as a problem to fix and started seeing it as just one part of me, alongside the emotional depth she knew was there. This approach, acknowledging both the conscious identity and the shadow, created space for integration. Mark didn't have to defend his stoicism, which paradoxically allowed his emotional expressiveness to emerge more naturally. The words that awakened his deeper desires were those that honored his wholeness, rather than fragmenting him into acceptable and unacceptable parts. Jung would suggest that true desire, not just fleeting want, but soul-level yearning, emerges from this integration of conscious and unconscious elements. When someone speaks to us in a way that honors both our daylight self and our shadow, desire awakens, not as lack seeking fulfillment, but as wholeness seeking expression. This integration reveals another truth. What we most deeply desire isn't separate from who we truly are. The language that awakens authentic desire isn't creating something new, but unveiling what was always there, waiting beneath the adaptations and compromises we've made to fit into our families, communities, and culture. For centuries, across countless cultures, initiation rituals served this purpose, guiding young men to recognize and integrate both their conscious qualities and their shadows. These rituals used symbolic language, challenges, and community witnessing to facilitate this psychological integration. While few modern men experience formal initiation, the need for integration remains. The words that serve this integration aren't manipulative. They're revelatory. They create conditions where a man can safely acknowledge the fullness of who he is, both the parts he shows to the world and the qualities he's learned to hide or deny. When someone feels permission to be their complete self, energy previously spent maintaining separation becomes available for authentic expression and connection. What would it mean to speak to the men in your life with this fullness in mind? To choose words that honor both their conscious identity and their shadow aspects as equally valuable parts of a greater whole? This isn't about forcing disclosure or demanding vulnerability. It's about creating linguistic spaces where integration can naturally occur. When we speak to each other from this perspective, desire shifts from something we chase outside ourselves to something we uncover within. The secret words that awaken a man's deepest desire are ultimately those that invite him into his own wholeness, where nothing human remains foreign or forbidden to him. There exists a profound difference between words that merely stimulate temporary interest and those that catalyze genuine transformation. Jung recognized this distinction when he studied alchemy. That ancient practice he saw as a symbolic parallel to psychological growth. Like the alchemist who sought to transform lead into gold, our words can either remain at the surface level of everyday communication, or they can become vessels for transformative power. The alchemical process Jung described involves several stages: the nigredo, blackening, albedo, whitening, citrinitas, yellowing, and rubedo, reddening. These aren't just historical curiosities. They map perfectly onto the psychological journey awakened when we engage with someone at the level of their deepest desires. Consider the nigredo stage, the initial confrontation with the prima materia, the raw substance of our unconscious. When we speak words that invite someone to acknowledge their unfulfilled longings or unaddressed wounds, we're initiating this stage. It often feels like darkness before dawn, a necessary dissolution before rebuilding. Evan, a construction contractor from Arizona, described this experience after his partner asked him a question that seemed simple but penetrated deeply. What are you building with your life that will truly last? The question disturbed him in the best possible way. It dissolved his convenient assumptions about purpose and legacy, creating the nigredo state where transformation begins. That question haunted me for weeks, he shared. I realized I'd been measuring success by quarterly profits rather than meaning. It wasn't comfortable, but it was exactly what I needed to hear. The language that initiates transformation often creates this productive discomfort, not shame which diminishes us, but the sacred discontent that motivates growth. Jung would call this the tension of opposites, where conflicting aspects of the psyche create the energy necessary for change. Moving into the albedo stage, we encounter clarity and insight. Here, the words that awaken desire are those that illuminate patterns previously hidden from awareness. This isn't about imposing external knowledge, but helping someone recognize what they already know unconsciously. Jason, a marketing executive from Seattle, described how a mentor's observation transformed his understanding of his own motivations. You seem to take on impossible challenges, not just to achieve, but to prove your worth. This simple reflection illuminated a pattern he'd never recognized. His achievement drive wasn't just about success, but about establishing his fundamental value as a person. Once I saw that pattern, Jason said, I couldn't unsee it, and seeing it gave me choice where I previously had none. This is the illumination of the albedo stage. Not criticism, but clarity that liberates. The language that facilitates this stage often uses reflective questioning. I notice you often observed pattern. I'm curious what that provides for you. Such formulations invite self-discovery rather than imposing external interpretation. They create conditions where insight can emerge naturally. In the citrinitas stage, new values and perspectives begin to form. The words that support this phase help integrate emerging insights into a coherent new vision. They bridge the gap between awareness and embodied change. Consider Charles, a financial advisor from Chicago, who had always approached relationships through the lens of transaction and negotiation, skills that served him professionally but limited his personal connections. During a weekend retreat, a facilitator observed, "You've mastered the mathematics of relationships. I wonder what might happen if you explored their poetry." This metaphoric language, contrasting mathematics with poetry, offered Charles a new framework for understanding connection. It wasn't directive or prescriptive, but opened conceptual space for a different approach to relationship. That reframing changed everything, Charles explained. I'd always seen emotional openness as inefficient or impractical. Thinking of it as relationship poetry gave me permission to value connection differently. The Citrinitas stage involves this revaluation, where what was previously dismissed as unimportant becomes recognized as valuable. The language that facilitates this often employs metaphor, reframing, and the introduction of new conceptual categories that expand how someone understands their experience. Finally, in the rubido stage, transformation becomes embodied in concrete. Action and identity. The words that support this phase connect insight with agency. They help bridge understanding and action. For Robert, a physician from Dallas, this came through a question from his teenage son. Dad, you help everyone else. Be healthy, but when will you decide you deserve the same care? This question, asked without judgment but with genuine curiosity, catalyzed a profound shift. Robert began prioritizing his own well-being after decades of self-neglect disguised as dedication to patients. The language that supports the rubedo phase often addresses agency directly. Given what you now understand, what becomes possible? Or how might you honor this insight through action? These formulations invite embodied change rather than merely intellectual understanding. Throughout all these alchemical stages, Jung emphasized the importance of symbols, those images and ideas that bridge conscious understanding and unconscious energy. The most powerful words often function as symbols, carrying meaning beyond their literal definition. When we tell a man he's strong, we're not just describing physical capacity, but invoking the archetypal warrior and his ability to protect what matters. When we acknowledge someone's vision, we're not just noting perception, but honoring the archetypal magician who transforms reality through insight. These symbolic dimensions give language its power to awaken desire at the deepest levels. In contemporary American culture, men are often addressed primarily through the language of achievement, competition, and external validation. While not inherently problematic, this narrow linguistic range fails to engage the full spectrum of male experience. The words that truly awaken desire speak to purpose beyond achievement, connection beyond competition, and worth beyond validation. Research in interpersonal neurobiology demonstrates that when someone feels genuinely understood, their nervous system shifts from defensive posturing to open receptivity. This physiological state, what neuroscientist Stephen Porges calls the ventral vagal state, is where authentic connection and growth become possible. The right words literally change our biology, creating conditions where defenses naturally lower and authentic desire can emerge. The capacity to speak this transformative language isn't reserved for therapists or professional communicators. It emerges naturally when we approach others with genuine curiosity and respect for their complexity. Jung himself noted that the most healing conversations often occur between people who are both engaged in their own growth process, what he called wounded healers, who can recognize both strength and struggle in others because they've encountered both within themselves. This points to a critical truth. Our ability to awaken desire in others is directly proportional to our willingness to acknowledge the full range of desire within ourselves. Jung called this process individuation, the lifelong journey towards psychological wholeness that requires integrating both conscious and unconscious elements of the psyche. Adam, a university professor from Minnesota, described how his relationship with his father transformed when he began approaching their conversations differently. Instead of trying to fix him or change him, I became genuinely curious about his experience. I started asking questions I actually wanted answers to, rather than questions designed to lead him somewhere. This shift from strategic communication to authentic curiosity changed everything. For the first time in decades, we started having real conversations, Adam explained, not because I found some magical technique, but because I stopped treating him as a problem to solve and started recognizing his full humanity. This touches on perhaps the most profound secret of transformative language. Its power emerges not primarily from technique, but from the quality of presence behind the words. When we speak from integrated awareness, acknowledging both our light and shadow, we naturally create space for others to do the same. The secret words that awaken a man's deepest desire are ultimately those spoken from this place of integrated presence. They emerge not from strategic calculation, but from genuine connection to our own depth. As Jung observed, the meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, Both are transformed. This alchemical transformation doesn't require specialized knowledge, but rather a willingness to engage authentically. The words themselves matter less than the consciousness from which they emerge. When we speak from wholeness, acknowledging both strength and vulnerability, certainty and mystery, knowing and not knowing, we naturally create conditions where others can access their own wholeness. Consider how rarely most people experience being addressed this way, as complete human beings rather than as functions or roles. How often do the men in your life hear language that acknowledges both their capability and their sensitivity, their wisdom and their woundedness, their power and their vulnerability? Jung would suggest that this integrated address is what the soul most deeply desires. The most powerful communication creates what the poet Rainer Maria Rilke called a protecting of solitudes, where each person's uniqueness is honored while creating genuine connection. This paradoxical achievement, simultaneous autonomy and belonging, addresses what Jung saw as the fundamental human struggle to be both distinct individuals and part of something larger than ourselves. Tyler, a veteran from Colorado, described how his life changed when a counselor asked him, "What parts of your strength have become burdens, and what aspects of your vulnerability might become sources of power?" This question honored both his courage and his woundedness, creating space for a more integrated self-understanding. "That question gave me permission to be both strong and broken," Tyler explained. "Not either or, but both and. It changed how I see myself, how I relate to others, everything." This integration represents the culmination of Jung's alchemical process, what he called the conjunctio, or sacred marriage of opposites within the psyche. The words that facilitate this integration acknowledge contradictory aspects of experience, without attempting to resolve them prematurely. They honor paradox, rather than enforcing artificial coherence. The language that awakens a man's deepest desire ultimately invites him into this alchemical journey, not by offering quick fixes or temporary stimulation, but by creating conditions where genuine transformation becomes possible. Such language recognizes that authentic desire isn't about what we want to have, but about who we are becoming. In the Jungian framework, this becoming involves recognizing and integrating the archetypes that shape human experience. The hero who seeks challenge and growth, the sage who pursues wisdom and understanding, the caregiver who protects and nurtures, the explorer who seeks new frontiers of experience, and many others. The words that awaken desire speak to these archetypal energies, inviting their conscious expression. When we communicate with awareness of these archetypal dimensions, our words naturally carry greater resonance and transformative potential. We're no longer just exchanging information, but engaging with the mythic structures that organize human experience at the deepest levels. This approach to communication, grounded in Jung's understanding of the psyche, offers a pathway beyond manipulation or technique toward authentic connection. It suggests that the most powerful words aren't those designed to control or influence, but those that emerge from genuine presence and respect for human complexity. The secret words that awaken a man's deepest desire are ultimately those that honor the fullness of who he is and who he might become, not through imposition of external standards, but through illumination of internal potential. They create conditions where authentic desire can emerge, not as lack-seeking fulfillment, but as essence-seeking expression.